right. Today's scripture passage is Genesis 41, 1a, and 8 through 16. And you're invited to turn there, or you can follow along on the screen behind. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one could interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires."
Thank you, Tyler. I think all of us tend to really like rags to riches stories. I think we would all like to be a rags to riches story. I think that's kind of why we play the lottery. That's why we enter the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes, because we want to be that rags to riches story. I think that's one of the reasons why we're drawn to the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, because it feels very much like a rags to riches story. Remember, when we last saw Joseph, he was just thrown in prison. He was a foreigner, a slave in a land that was not his own, falsely accused, and now he's been imprisoned for something he did not do. You can't get a whole lot lower than to be an imprisoned slave. And here he was. And yet in chapter 41, we find this man, Joseph, being brought before the most powerful man in the entire world at the time, most likely, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. But I want to caution you, this isn't just a simple story of a small town boy making it big by working hard and pulling himself up by his bootstraps. And it's not the American success story that you're all so fond of. Nor is this the story of a person who's born a pauper becoming a princess like Cinderella. No, it's more than that. Really, to be honest with you, this is a story about the purposes of God as God sort of directs traffic on the stage of human history. And I kind of pictured the guys down on the tarmac with those orange things, you know, God's kind of doing that with people here in this story, but the people don't know what's going on. But you and I, with the benefit of hindsight, can see what God was doing, and nobody would have ever understood what God was doing or how he was going to get from point A to point B. And that's one of the things that's so marvelous about this story. Now, since we last talked about Joseph last Sunday, Joseph's been languishing in prison. Well, languishing might not be the right word, because Joseph was a very successful imprisoned slave. In other words, people loved Joseph, and he kept being given more and more responsibility. But I have to tell you, Joseph didn't want to be in Egypt. He didn't want to be a slave. He didn't want to be in prison. He wanted none of that. He didn't ask for any of it. And yet, 2 more years have passed since Joseph encountered this high-ranking official of the king of Egypt, who was also in prison, and interpreted his dream for him. If you remember the cupbearer, the guy who was in charge of the vineyards of Egypt, the royal vineyards. And Joseph interpreted the dream for him and gave him a favorable interpretation from God. And the other prisoner was not quite so fortunate. But Joseph told this cupbearer, look, when you were restored to your position, which actually happened, remember me before Pharaoh? Well, 2 years have passed as Joseph remains a prisoner, and nothing has been said. Crickets. Joseph has been dealt a raw deal yet again, as his life is just frittering away, seemingly. Keep in mind now, Joseph landed in Egypt at 17. He's now 30. His late teens and all of his 20s were spent not in a way you'd want to spend your late teens and your 20s. Enslaved in a foreign land, trafficked, and then thrown in the slammer for something he didn't do. This was Joseph's experience. Now finally, as the story progresses, we find that one night the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, has a rough one. He's not sleeping well. His sleep keeps getting interrupted by dreams. He has 2 dreams, and these dreams are troubling to him. For some reason, Pharaoh seems to understand that these are not just run-of-the-mill ordinary dreams that you have all the time. I mean, you all have dreams. You probably had the experience where you have a bad dream and it wakes you up and you can't get back to sleep. But Pharaoh was really troubled even in the morning when after he'd had these dreams. He had the sense that these were important dreams and they meant something. And he needed to find out what these dreams meant. And so what Pharaoh does is he calls together what the scriptures call his magicians and wise men to hold consultation with them about what these dreams could possibly have been about. Now think about these magicians / wise men for a few minutes. These are not the kinds of magicians that you might hire to come and perform at your kid's birthday party, with the tuxedo and the top hat and all. These are not what these guys were. Probably it would do you well to think in terms of the Magi of the Christmas story, which would have been another 400 to 500 years later than that. But this is the type of men that we're dealing with here. Of course, in the Christmas story, those guys are from Persia. But in Joseph's case, these magicians, these / wise men, were Egyptian. Now what they were is that they were of the priestly class. These were the most educated, most learned, most privileged, most wise men in the land of Egypt at the time. And they formed the council for Pharaoh. And what can I say about these guys? These guys were practiced in astrology. They were well versed in the world of the occult and the black arts, we might call them. They were studied in things like dreams and omens and celestial signs and spells and all of this stuff. All you need to do is make sort of a comparison between this moment and a moment about 400 years later when Moses stands before a later Pharaoh, and he's sent by God, and God says through Moses, "Let my people go." Of course, the people that he was going to be letting go was the people who were just now beginning with Joseph. But at that time, Pharaoh, as he sees miraculous signs done by God through Moses, he calls for his wise men and his magicians, and they come and they duplicate all of the miracles that God is doing through Moses. Almost all of them. Not all of them. So that's what you should be thinking about when you think of these guys that Pharaoh calls together to help him understand his dreams. They were holy men. They had an in with the Egyptian deities, which were not really deities at all, but they were so-called deities. So Pharaoh calls them together, and he tells them his dreams. But lo and behold, the wisest men, the most holy men in all of Egypt, could not unlock the message of the dreams. Now, I think there's a reason for that, because God is at work. It was God who was given all of these dreams that filled this whole story of Joseph. Remember when Joseph was a boy and he had these dreams about one day his being elevated and his siblings and his family bowing down before him? You remember all of that? And you remember Joseph interpreting the dreams of the 2 high officials in prison? And now we've got these dreams that are given to the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. God is the one who's giving all these dreams because God is doing something. As I said before, these are not run-of-the-mill ordinary dreams that fill our lives and our nights. These are dreams that God is giving for a purpose. And that was known. So it's not surprised then that God might lock up the meaning of Pharaoh's dreams so that Pharaoh's magicians can't understand them. Because God has a purpose to elevate Joseph in the situation. So this is what God is doing. And so, catching wind of the king's dream troubles, guess what happens? The cupbearer who 2 years ago got let out of prison because of Joseph, he remembers Joseph 2 years down the road. And he says to the Pharaoh, look, Pharaoh, there is this guy, this weird thing happened when you were unhappy with me and the other official and you threw us into the dungeon. There was this Hebrew slave who was in prison for something in there. And me and the other official, we both had these dreams, and we didn't know what they meant. But we told them to Joseph, and Joseph told us exactly what these dreams meant. He told us what the fulfillment was. And lo and behold, 3 days later, it came about exactly as Joseph had said. And so Pharaoh listens to his cupbearer, and he decrees that Joseph should be sent for. Joseph should be brought out of the dungeon and brought before him. Now, I kind of thought about this a little bit this week. Can you imagine what that would have been like for Joseph? If you're in prison and the highest official in the land, the king of Egypt, sends for you, I wonder what's going through your mind. You think you might be a little bit nervous? Think you might be a little bit surprised? Now, if you're Joseph and you've had his experiences, you might be thinking, is this another kick in the gut coming? Because this keeps happening to me. And so I kind of had this picture of Joseph. There's a picture we're going to put up on the screen for you. This is not Joseph, but this picture makes me think of Joseph, or vice versa. This is actually a still from the movie The Count of Monte Cristo. And this is Edmond Dantes, who is imprisoned on Chateau d'If for a crime which he did not commit. And he is in a dungeon. And I would imagine that Joseph may have looked and smelt something like this man after years in the dungeon, even though he was a person of responsibility in the dungeon. He was still an inmate. And he was not lavished with all kinds of pampering. So, the first thing that happens when Pharaoh sends for Joseph, for much to Joseph's surprise, he is allowed to shower and shave his face, and he's given a new clean set of clothes. All of this, not for Joseph's benefit, so they wouldn't be offensive to Pharaoh. And he's brought before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says to Joseph, Joseph, I understand that you are supposed to be able to tell the meaning of a dream upon having heard it. And look what Joseph says in reply. This is verse 16. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And that struck me. You know, we live in a day when we're taught to be self-confident. I think of athletes and how there's always this line that's talked about between self-confidence and arrogance. Do you know what I'm saying? And so we struggle to find that line. You got to believe in yourself. Joseph was not self-confident. Joseph was what I called God-confident. Joseph did not trust in himself. He trusted in God. He didn't trust his own giftedness. He trusted the one who had given the gifts. And Joseph knew that he was nothing in and of himself. And he wanted all confidence, all trust, all credit to be directed to his God in all of this. And so he directs the attention there. Now, Pharaoh, I'm thinking, is making notes of what he's seeing in this young man as he begins to speak. And then he begins to lay out for Joseph the content of his dreams. Now, the content of the dreams is a little bit strange, but not nearly as strange as some of the dreams I've had. And I don't think our dreams are supposed to mean something all the time. So as I told you before, I don't think you're supposed to come out of here thinking, well, I need to understand my dreams and make life decisions based upon my dreams. Absolutely not. But this was miraculous stuff. And as the Pharaoh begins to tell Joseph about his dreams, here's what he says. Joseph, I dreamed that I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and all of a sudden, out of the Nile came 7 cows, the likes of which you have never seen. These were extraordinary cows. Have any cow lovers out there? Well, these were the best cows you could ever dream of seeing. They were fat, they were sleek, they were beautiful, they were extraordinarily healthy and well fed. And following upon those came 7 more cows, and these were the most ridiculous, ugly, absurd, disgusting cattle I've ever seen in my life. They were gaunt, they were skinny, they were sickly and unhealthy. Now, Joseph, what happened in my dream was these sickly, disgusting cattle swallowed up the healthy ones. And it was disturbing to me. And what was even worse, he says, is that the appearance of the nasty cows got no better for having consumed the healthy ones. And I woke up and I was very troubled. And he said, Joseph, I fell back asleep and I had a second dream. And the second one was this. There was a stalk of wheat or something that grew up. And I looked, and on that stalk of wheat were 7 magnificently formed, perfect heads of grain. You could find no better in all of Egypt. And immediately upon the heels of that came 7 more heads of grain. But these were pathetic. They were scorched. They were gnarly. They were scorched by the east wind. And then in my dream, these terrible, scorched heads of grain swallowed up the good ones. And they were no better off for having done so. Needless to say, Joseph, I have been troubled and tormented about what these dreams mean. Now, Joseph, upon hearing the dreams, seems to have no hesitation whatsoever. God seems to absolutely unlock the meaning of these dreams on the fly in Joseph's mind. And Joseph responds to the Pharaoh, and he says this, and I'm not quoting Joseph, I'm paraphrasing Joseph. This is what Joseph communicates. Pharaoh, these dreams, Your Highness, have one and the same message. They both mean the same thing. God is revealing to you, Your Highness, what he is about to do in the land of Egypt and in the surrounding region. It is settled. It is decreed. Now stop for just a minute and think what's happening here. Do you realize that a pagan, non-God-fearing king is being given revelation directly from God? Now that is a very strange idea for a lot of us, but this is not the only time you find this happening in Scripture. You have God graciously telling the most powerful man on the face of the planet at the time what was going to happen over the next 14 years. Why would God do that? I'm not prepared to answer that question, but I just want you to think about it because it stretches your understanding of God a little bit. This is the grace of God. And he even puts his man, Joseph, on the spot to translate the dreams for him. What a gift. Now, Joseph continues in what he's saying. He's saying, it's settled, Pharaoh. Your Highness, 7 years of superabundance are about to come. But they won't last, Pharaoh. Following those 7 years, you need to know that 7 more years of the worst famine this world has yet seen are coming upon the earth. Now, Pharaoh, God is telling you that you must make a plan. You must act now. You must select somebody and put that person in charge over all of the food production of Egypt, and have that person reserve portions of the produce each year so that when that famine comes, there will be enough food left in Egypt to sustain the people throughout that famine. Now, what is striking to me is that you realize that Pharaoh never once questions the facts that were given to him through this Hebrew slave who was dragged out of the dungeon before him. Never once. What would cause Pharaoh to trust a young man like this? Now remember, he's 30 years old now, and he's just spent 13 years as a slave and in a prison. And Pharaoh trusts what he says. Now, I have to believe, guys, Pharaoh and his cabinet are stunned as Joseph stands there and he tells them what God is laying upon his heart. Never anywhere have they seen such a hold on the truth, they've never seen such forthright and lucid grasp of the will of God. They are stunned with this young man's insight, his composure, his clarity, and they certainly don't know what to make of his connection with the deities. None of the deity knowers in Egypt could do this. And here is this Hebrew slave who seems to be of one mind with God, a God that is foreign to these Egyptians. He's not one of their pantheon. And they listen to it, and they receive it as though God himself were standing before them, telling them what to do. And so Pharaoh looks around, and without even questioning the facts, he says to his cabinet, is there anyone in Egypt anywhere at all like this young man? And they all go, no. And he turns to Joseph and he says, Joseph, you're in charge. From this moment on, you are the second highest ranking official in the most powerful civilization on the face of the earth at this moment. And he takes off his signet ring and he gives it to Joseph. He orders up a robe of the finest linen. Here we go again, Joseph and his clothes. Those clothes that keep getting him in trouble. But this one doesn't get him into trouble. Now he's got the finest robe in the land. He orders up royal jewelry for Joseph of the finest gold in Egypt. He gives Joseph the keys to a brand new chariot, the chariot of the second highest ranking official in Egypt. And he issues the edict that wherever Joseph goes in that chariot, people will say, make way for Joseph, the second highest ranking official in all of Egypt. And he crowns Joseph with a new name, an Egyptian royal name. As if to say, Joseph, you are no longer a slave. You are no longer a foreigner. And then he gives as a gift to Joseph the most highly sought after bachelorette in all of Egypt, the daughter of the priest of On. Now, guys, this happens in the space of a couple of hours. From dungeon to dignitary. You want to talk rags to riches. This is extraordinary. Now, over the course of the next 7 years, these are the years of abundance, we see Joseph again doing what God does with Joseph, prospering. Everything he sets his hand to prospers. He administrates this whole situation in Egypt brilliantly because God has given him administrative gifting, which he has cut his chops in while he was a slave and then while he was a prisoner. And over these 7 years, God gives him 2 sons whose names may be familiar to you. Their names are Manasseh and Ephraim. Recognize the names? 2 of the tribes of Israel. Now, what's fascinating to me is to watch Joseph explain why he gave them these names. Verses 51 and 52. You haven't read these yet this morning. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, and he said, it's because God has made me forget all my what? My what? My trouble and all my father's household. Question. Is not Joseph, by naming his son after his trouble and his father's household, remembering his trouble? And every time he speaks that name, will he not remember what it means? So this is not forgetting like you and I understand forget. And the passage continues. The second son he named Ephraim. And he said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my what? My suffering. He names his sons after his trouble and his suffering. And what it struck me in all of this, as God is elevating him, there's a note of pain in all of this for Joseph that never goes away. And yet, here is God doing something magnificent through him. But it is not without its pain and its trouble and its suffering. And his children, for the rest of Joseph's life, will remind him of this. Every time he speaks those beautiful names, Manasseh and Ephraim, he will remember what he says he's forgetting. Very interesting thing. Now, as I wrap this up for you, I want to tell you that this rags to riches story does not teach us a couple of things that you might walk away from this story with. Number one, it does not teach us that every sufferer is going to be raised to glory in this life, like Joseph was. No, you cannot expect to be made the second highest ranking official in the land just because you've experienced suffering. No, if you get that message out of this, you're wrong. It doesn't mean that you're going to be recompensed in this life for your suffering. It also doesn't teach that faithful diligence will always get you acknowledged and be justly rewarded in this life, even though it was for Joseph. The story does not teach you that. So don't leave with those messages. There are two messages that I do think, actually, there are three messages that I do think that you need to take away from this morning. Well, there are many that you could take away, but these are the three I want to offer to you. As you read this story, I think this episode of Joseph's life teaches us, number one, that God's sense of timing is always way better than yours is. You remember that Joseph asked to have the cupbearer put in a word with Pharaoh 2 years ago? So what is Joseph thinking as month after month after month after month tick away? Nothing. God's sense of timing is always better than yours. And when you don't get what you think you're supposed to have, number one, maybe you're not supposed to have it. Number two, why do you think that you know the right timing? Second lesson I think you can take from this is that God knows when to lower you and when to raise you up. And for a couple of different reasons. Number one, he knows what's good for you. And number two, he knows what needs to be done all around you. And could it be that your being lowered has nothing to do with you? Maybe it does. And can you trust God in his judgment with whether or not he ever does raise you up? Because we're not all going to be Joseph. And the third lesson I want you to take from this is this. You can honor your Father in heaven just as much by serving faithfully in low places, like a dungeon, as you can by serving God in high places, like second highest ranking official in all of Egypt. In fact, the Bible teaches, and we've talked about this before, many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. So guys, it's not about the position, it's about your devotion to him in whatever position you find yourself in. That's what matters.